The wedding dress hung pristine on the closet door, waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. The date was June 4th. It was planned to be a day of celebration in North Huntingdon, Pennsylvania, a township nestled in Westmoreland County, where suburban streets lined with modest homes spoke of quiet, predictable lives. For Samantha Miller, 25 years old, and Mark Jenkins, 27, it was meant to be the culmination of years together, a new beginning sealed with vows exchanged before friends and family at the local community hall. The air that morning held the usual late spring warmth, thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, a stark contrast to the sterile chill that would soon descend upon the residents on Birch Lane. Every detail of the wedding was meticulously planned, from the floral arrangements sitting in water buckets on the porch to the seating chart laid out on the dining room table, untouched programs stacked neatly beside it. Samantha was at her family home, a familiar two-story house where she had grown up, preparing with her bridesmaids. Mark was at his own place across town, getting ready with his best man. The rhythm of the morning was one of joyful anticipation, veiled only by the typical pre-wedding jitters. Yet, beneath the surface of this ordinary day, currents of betrayal and hidden truths were swirling, poised to break the calm surface. Samantha's parents moved through the house, a mixture of pride and slight anxiety on their faces, ensuring everything was in place for the photographer's arrival. The house was filled with light and nervous energy, a scene of domestic peace on the brink of irreversible violation. The future, envisioned just hours before, was about to be brutally erased, replaced by silence and dread. Mark Jenkins was known in North Huntingdon as a hard-working young man, steady and reliable, employed at a local manufacturing plant. Samantha worked as a dental hygienist. Their relationship was seen as solid, conventional, built on shared community ties and mutual friends. They had dated for 5 years before Mark proposed on a weekend trip to the Poconos. The engagement was met with approval from both families. The Millers and the Jenkinses were respected members of the community, known for their involvement in local events and their seemingly stable lives. Mark's father, Robert Jenkins, a man in his late 50s, was particularly proud of his son and his impending marriage, often speaking highly of Samantha. Robert Jenkins was a quiet man, recently retired from a long career at the same manufacturing plant as Mark. He lived alone since the passing of his wife several years prior. His relationship with Mark appeared close, built on shared interests like fishing and attending local baseball games. Samantha had also developed a friendly relationship with Robert over the years. She had been dating Mark, often joining them for dinners or family gatherings. There was no outward indication of any friction, no visible cracks in the facade of familial harmony that the Jenkins and Miller families presented to their community. The picture was one of a happy, blended future, cemented by the impending marriage. The morning progressed, the hours ticking down towards the planned ceremony time. The bridesmaids were in their dresses, hair and makeup finished. Samantha was putting on her veil, her reflection smiling back in the mirror, embodying the traditional image of a radiant bride. The wedding car was due to arrive shortly. Downstairs, the last-minute checks were being made, rings accounted for, licenses ready, flowers loaded into vehicles for transport to the hall. The house buzzed with activity, oblivious to the storm gathering miles away, where the groom was grappling with a revelation that would shatter this picture forever. The transition from hopeful preparation to devastating discovery was imminent, marked by a phone call that would rewrite the day's script from celebration to tragedy. The first hint that something was terribly wrong arrived not as a dramatic confrontation but as a chilling silence. Calls to Mark's phone went unanswered. As the time for him to leave for the wedding hall approached, unease rippled through the Miller home. The groom was not typically late, nor was he prone to disappearing without explanation. Samantha's father, David Miller, tried calling Robert Jenkins, Mark's father, hoping he might know where Mark was or why he was delayed. Robert also didn't answer his phone. The initial worry began to twist into something heavier, a knot of anxiety tightening in the stomachs of those waiting. As the planned ceremony time drew near, the decision was made to send someone to Mark's residence to check on him. A groomsman, accompanied by David Miller, drove the few miles across town to Mark's small rental house on Oak Avenue. The house was outwardly still, the blinds drawn. There were no cars in the driveway except Mark's sedan. The silence was unnerving. They knocked, then knocked louder. No response. A sense of dread began to settle over them, a premonition that this wasn't just a simple delay or cold feet. They found the back door unlocked. Pushing it open, They stepped into a scene that immediately canceled the day's joy and replaced it with unspeakable horror. The small living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, and on the floor, amidst the wreckage, was Samantha Miller. She was lying still, unresponsive, dressed in her wedding gown. The white fabric was stained red. The sight was immediate, brutal, and undeniable. The wedding day had found its horrific, unintended conclusion. The discovery triggered a chaotic response. David Miller immediately called 911, his voice hoarse with shock and grief. The groomsmen, pale and trembling, stumbled back outside. Within minutes, the first sirens could be heard approaching Oak Avenue. North Huntingdon Police Department officers arrived swiftly, their initial assessment confirming the grim reality. Samantha Miller was deceased. The scene was secured, yellow crime tape quickly encircling the small property, separating the quiet suburban street from the unfolding tragedy within. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered tentatively at the edges of the police cordon, their faces etched with disbelief and fear. Investigators from the Westmoreland County Detective's Office were notified and dispatched to the scene. This was no simple medical emergency or accident. It was immediately apparent that a violent crime had occurred. The presence of the deceased bride in her wedding dress added a layer of profound, almost surreal tragedy to the grim tableau. Initial observations by law enforcement noted the apparent signs of a struggle. The focus immediately shifted to locating Mark Jenkins, the groom. His absence from the scene was conspicuous and deeply concerning. He was now the primary person of interest in a homicide investigation. The hours that followed were a blur of official activity. Forensic technicians arrived, beginning the slow, meticulous process of documenting and collecting evidence from the house. Photographs were taken from every angle. Potential evidence was cataloged and bagged. The shattered lamp, overturned furniture, and crucially, the bullet casings found near the victim. The sheer contrast between the symbols of wedding preparation, scattered petals from a bouquet perhaps, mixed with debris, and the brutal reality of the crime scene created a haunting atmosphere. The silence inside the house was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of death and unanswered questions. The community's shock was palpable. A planned wedding turned murder scene on a quiet Saturday morning in North Huntingdon. The initial sweep of Mark Jenkins's residence on Oak Avenue yielded critical evidence. While the primary focus was the crime scene, a search for Mark himself was immediately launched. His car was still in the driveway, suggesting he hadn't fled far by vehicle. Law enforcement quickly established a perimeter and began searching the immediate neighborhood and surrounding areas. They also checked with friends and family, none of whom had seen or heard from him since early that morning. The clock was ticking. A potentially armed homicide suspect was unaccounted for. The sense of urgency among investigators intensified with every passing minute. Within hours of the discovery of Samantha Miller's body, Mark Jenkins was located. He was found several blocks away from his residence, walking along a quiet residential street, appearing disoriented and distressed. He did not attempt to flee when approached by officers. He was taken into custody without incident. He was immediately transported to the North Huntingdon Police Department for questioning. His demeanor was described by officers as withdrawn, compliant, but revealing little initially about the morning's events. The apprehension of the groom hours after the discovery of the bride's body solidified his position as the central figure in the investigation. Back at the Oak Avenue residence, the forensic processing continued. The Westmoreland County coroner arrived to examine the scene and oversee the removal of Samantha Miller's body. Dr. Albert Finley, the medical examiner, would conduct the autopsy the following day. The preliminary observations at the scene indicated multiple gunshot wounds. The presence of shell casings confirmed the use of a firearm. The caliber and type of weapon would become a crucial piece of evidence in tracing it back to the suspect. The state of the room, the signs of struggle, painted a picture of a violent confrontation preceding the fatal shots. It was not a calm, planned execution, but something seemingly erupting from a sudden, furious exchange. Investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing the timeline of that morning. They knew when the 911 call was made, roughly when David Miller and the groomsmen arrived. They needed to determine when Samantha arrived at Mark's house and what transpired in the hours or minutes leading up to the discovery. Interviews with neighbors provided some limited information. One reported hearing shouting from the direction of Mark's house earlier that morning, but dismissed it as an argument. Another mentioned seeing Mark's father, Robert Jenkins, leaving the house much earlier, around mid-morning, though they couldn't be precise about the time. This seemingly minor detail would take on greater significance later. The interrogation of Mark Jenkins began. Initially, he was cooperative, but reserved. He confirmed that Samantha had come to his house that morning to exchange gifts and spend some time together before they would part ways to get ready separately for the ceremony. He admitted they had argued. When pressed for the subject of the argument, his demeanor shifted. He became agitated, his answers evasive. Investigators used standard interview techniques, focusing on the physical evidence found at the scene, the disarray, the confirmed presence of bullet casings, the victim's injuries. Confronted with the undeniable facts of Samantha's death and his presence at the scene, Mark Jenkins eventually began to speak about the catalyst for the violence. His confession, delivered haltingly at first, then with bursts of emotional intensity, centered on a devastating discovery he claimed to have made that very morning. He stated that he had learned, just hours before their wedding, that Samantha had been having an affair. And not just any affair. He claimed she had been sleeping with his father, Robert Jenkins. This revelation, if true, provided a potential motive for the explosive violence that occurred. The claim was shocking, casting a dark shadow over the image of the respectable families and the planned celebration. The quiet town of North Huntingdon was now grappling with a narrative ripped from the pages of a dark domestic drama. The investigation now had a claimed motive, but the truth behind that motive needed rigorous verification. The claim made by Mark Jenkins, that Samantha had been having an affair with his father, Robert, was the crucial and deeply disturbing pivot point in the investigation. Investigators immediately recognized that validating this claim was paramount. Was it the truth, the motive for murder, or was it a desperate fabrication by a killer trying to justify an unthinkable act? The first step was to interview Robert Jenkins. He was located and brought in for questioning. His initial demeanor was one of shock and grief upon learning of Samantha's death and his son's arrest. He expressed disbelief regarding his son's alleged actions. When confronted with Mark's claim about the affair, Robert Jenkins became visibly distressed. He initially denied it vehemently. However, as investigators presented information hinting at potential corroboration, or perhaps sensing the gravity of the situation and the need for truth, his resistance began to falter. Under sustained questioning, his denials weakened. Eventually, Robert Jenkins made a partial admission. He confessed to a relationship with Samantha, describing it as a brief, ill-advised liaison that had occurred several months prior. He stated that they had both agreed it was a mistake, and had ended it, believing it was completely over and would remain a secret. This admission, however partial, lent significant weight to Mark's claim, and provided a powerful, albeit tragic, potential motive. The timing of Mark's alleged discovery was also critical. According to Mark's statement, he found evidence of the affair shortly after Samantha arrived at his house that morning. He claimed to have seen text messages or emails on Samantha's phone or computer that confirmed the relationship with his father. This detail needed forensic verification. Digital forensic experts were tasked with examining Samantha's electronic devices recovered from the crime scene. The contents of her phone, her computer, her email accounts, and social media were scoured for communications between her and Robert Jenkins. This digital trail could either validate or contradict Mark's account of how he learned the information and whether such communications existed. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the crime scene was being analyzed in detail. The firearm used in the shooting was recovered from Mark Jenkins's residence, hidden under a bed. It was a handgun registered to Mark. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the bullets recovered from Samantha's body and the shell casings found at the scene were fired from this weapon. Gunshot residue, GSR tests were conducted on Mark's hands and clothing, which could indicate whether he had recently fired a weapon. Forensic analysis takes time, but initial findings often confirm key facts quickly. The link between the weapon, the shell casings, and the victim was rapidly established, solidifying the case that Samantha was shot by Mark with his own gun at his residence. The autopsy report from Dr. Finley confirmed Samantha Miller's cause of death as multiple gunshot wounds. The report detailed the entry and exit points of the bullets, providing information about the trajectory and potentially the relative positions of the victim and perpetrator during the shooting. This physical evidence from the victim's body could be correlated with the crime scene analysis, the location of shell casings, blood spatter patterns, and the state of the room. to reconstruct the sequence of events. The report also provided a more precise time of death, narrowing the window during which the fatal incident occurred. All evidence pointed towards a violent altercation culminating in the shooting, fitting the narrative of a sudden, rage-fueled act following a devastating revelation. The quiet suburb of North Huntingdon was now processing not just a murder, but a betrayal tearing apart two families on what should have been a day of unity. With the preliminary investigation concluding and significant evidence gathered, charges were formally filed against Mark Jenkins. Given the circumstances, including the victim's death by firearm, and the alleged motive rooted in a violent reaction, Mark Jenkins was charged with homicide. The charge was processed at the Westmoreland County Courthouse in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. The news of the charges, and the underlying alleged motive, sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the community. The idea that the groom would murder his bride hours before their wedding, potentially over an affair with his own father, was almost too grim to comprehend for the residents of North Huntingdon. Mark Jenkins was arraigned, where he was formally read the charges against him. He was held without bail due to the severity of the charge. A public defender was appointed to represent him, as his family indicated they were unable to afford private counsel, further highlighting the devastating financial as well as emotional toll of the events. The legal process had officially begun. The preliminary hearing was scheduled, where the prosecution would present enough evidence to convince a judge that there was probable cause to believe Mark Jenkins committed the crime and the case should proceed to trial. This initial stage would offer a glimpse into the evidence the prosecution intended to rely upon. The digital forensics analysis yielded crucial results. Data recovered from Samantha Miller's phone included a series of text messages exchanged with a contact, saved under the name Robert. The content of these messages, while often coded or discreet, clearly indicated a past intimate relationship. Dates and times on the messages aligned with Robert Jenkins's admission of a liaison several months prior to the wedding date. More significantly, there were messages exchanged in the weeks and days leading up to the wedding that suggested ongoing communication, albeit less frequent, and a shared secret between Samantha and Robert. There was no definitive proof of an ongoing physical affair right up to the wedding day within these messages, but they confirmed the existence of the secret relationship and continuous contact, providing a factual basis for Mark's claim that something illicit had occurred between them. The prosecution began building its case, focusing on the timeline and the physical evidence. They intended to argue that Mark Jenkins, upon discovering the extent of the betrayal, whether through these messages or another source on the morning of the wedding, became enraged. The state of the house, the signs of a struggle, supported the theory of a sudden violent outburst rather than a premeditated act. However, the charge of homicide encompasses different degrees, including first degree, premeditated, second degree, during commission of another felony, and third degree, any other kind of killing with malice. The prosecution had to decide which degree the evidence best supported, or present all possibilities to a jury. The defense, meanwhile, began exploring angles focused on Mark's state of mind at the time of the shooting. Testimony from witnesses began to corroborate aspects of the timeline. Neighbors confirmed hearing shouting. Family members recounted the frantic search for Mark. Initial statements from those who knew Samantha and Mark offered a picture of their relationship leading up to the wedding, some noting small signs of stress or arguments, others believing they were a perfectly happy couple. The contrast between the public face of their relationship and the private turmoil revealed by the alleged affair became a prominent theme. The quiet lives of these North Huntingdon families were being laid bare in the harsh light of a criminal investigation, revealing layers of deception and hidden pain beneath the surface of suburban normalcy. The legal battle was set to dissect the final moments of Samantha's life and the dark secret that allegedly triggered the violence. The preliminary hearing took place at the Westmoreland County Courthouse in Greensburg. The prosecution presented its initial evidence, testimony from the responding officers describing the gruesome scene, the findings of the forensic technicians regarding the recovered firearm and shell casings, and the initial findings from the medical examiner confirming the cause of death. Crucially, they also introduced evidence regarding the alleged motive. A detective testified about Mark Jenkins's statement regarding the affair, and introduced the digital evidence recovered from Samantha's phone, including the text messages exchanged with Robert Jenkins. Robert Jenkins himself was called to testify. His appearance was somber, his voice quiet as he reluctantly confirmed the prior intimate relationship with Samantha Miller, his son's fiancée. He maintained it was brief and over, but the admission itself was damning context for the events of June. The defense argued that while the facts of the shooting were not in dispute, that Mark Jenkins fired the shots that killed Samantha Miller. The circumstances surrounding the act were critical. They focused on the element of sudden provocation. Mark's state of mind upon discovering the alleged affair with his father, just hours before his wedding, was central to their potential strategy. They suggested this revelation could have caused a sudden, overwhelming emotional disturbance, potentially reducing the level of culpability from first or second-degree homicide to third-degree, or even voluntary manslaughter in some jurisdictions, depending on how the law on heat of passion was interpreted in Pennsylvania. The court had to weigh the evidence presented and determine if there was sufficient probable cause to hold Mark for trial on the homicide charge. After hearing the evidence, the judge ruled that there was sufficient probable cause, and Mark Jenkins was formally held for court on the charge of homicide. The case moved forward to the trial phase. This meant a grand jury would likely review the evidence to formally indict him, or the prosecution would proceed based on the preliminary hearing outcome depending on state procedures. Regardless, the case was proceeding towards a jury trial, where the full weight of the evidence and the complex emotional narrative would be presented. The legal process was methodical, a stark contrast to the explosive speed with which the tragedy had unfolded. As the case moved into the pre-trial phase, both the prosecution and defense engaged in discovery, exchanging evidence and witness lists. The defense commissioned a psychological evaluation of Mark Jenkins, seeking expert opinion on his mental state at the time of the shooting and how the alleged discovery of the affair might have impacted his actions. They aimed to build a case, emphasizing his emotional turmoil and the severity of the betrayal he claimed to have experienced. The prosecution, meanwhile, continued to solidify their case, focusing on the intent implied by using a deadly weapon and the tragic finality of Samantha's death. They also sought to understand the nature of the argument that preceded the shooting in Mark's residence. Further details emerged about the relationship dynamics. Statements from friends and family were scrutinized for any signs of trouble. Some witnesses described Mark as having a temper. Others saw him as calm and reserved. Opinions on Samantha were varied, painting a picture of a young woman navigating complex relationships. The role of Robert Jenkins remained a significant, painful point. While not charged with any crime related to the shooting, his admission had ignited the fuse for the tragedy. His future testimony, or lack thereof, would be critical. The community of North Huntingdon watched, grappling with the layers of scandal and violence that had shattered their sense of security, and turned a wedding day into a crime scene debated in courtroom. The meticulous legal machinery ground forward, attempting to find clarity in the chaos. The trial of Mark Jenkins commenced at the Westmoreland County Courthouse in Greensburg. The courtroom was filled with media, members of both families, and curious onlookers from North Huntingdon and surrounding areas. The atmosphere was heavy, tense. The prosecution opened its case by presenting the stark facts. Samantha Miller was shot and killed by the defendant, Mark Jenkins, on the morning of her wedding day at his residence. They laid out the timeline, the discovery of the body, the collection of forensic evidence linking Mark and his firearm to the crime. They presented graphical yet necessary evidence including crime scene photographs and autopsy findings, detailing the fatal injuries Samantha sustained. Witnesses for the prosecution included the North Huntingdon police officers who first responded, the forensic technicians who processed the scene, and the lead detective who interviewed Mark Jenkins. The detective recounted Mark's statement, including the claim about the affair with his father. The digital evidence, the text messages between Samantha and Robert, was formally introduced and shown to the jury, providing concrete support for the existence of their secret relationship. The medical examiner, Dr. Finley, testified about the cause and manner of death, describing the path of the bullets and confirming the immediate lethality of the wounds. His testimony underscored the violent nature of the act. The defense, in their opening statement, did not dispute that Mark Jenkins caused Samantha's death. Instead, they focused on the why and the state of mind. Their case centered on the devastating impact of discovering the affair, arguing that this sudden and profound betrayal triggered a mental state that negated premeditation. They portrayed Mark not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a man pushed to the breaking point by an unimaginable revelation involving the two people closest to him, his future wife and his own father. They aimed to convince the jury that this was a case of heat of passion killing, which under Pennsylvania law could potentially reduce the charge to voluntary manslaughter. Robert Jenkins was a key, and deeply conflicted, witness. Called by the prosecution, he testified about his relationship with Samantha. His testimony was painful to watch for everyone in the courtroom. He confirmed the affair, describing it as a regretful mistake. He was cross-examined by the defense, who pressed him on the details of the relationship, its duration, and whether there were any ongoing communications or interactions that could have appeared active to someone discovering them. Robert Jenkins's demeanor was one of shame and sorrow, his words confirming the betrayal that Mark claimed had led to his actions. His testimony was pivotal in establishing the factual basis of the motive. The defense presented their case, calling character witnesses who spoke of Mark Jenkins's reputation as a normally calm, hard-working individual. They also called the psychologist who performed Mark's evaluation. The expert testified that, in their professional opinion, the sudden discovery of a betrayal involving his fiancée and father on his wedding day could induce a state of extreme emotional disturbance, potentially impairing his capacity for cool reflection and planning. The defense meticulously presented the timeline as they saw it: discovery of the affair, immediate confrontation, a struggle, and then the shooting, arguing that the entire sequence unfolded in a matter of minutes under the duress of this shock. The courtroom drama unfolded, dissecting the final tragic moments of Samantha Miller's life against the backdrop of a family secret. The presentation of evidence concluded. Both the prosecution and the defense prepared for closing arguments. The jury had heard detailed testimony about the crime scene, forensic evidence, the alleged affair confirmed by Robert Jenkins, and the psychological analysis of Mark Jenkins. They had seen the digital communication. They had grappled with the timeline and the state of the house, indicating a struggle. The weight of the tragedy hung heavy in the courtroom. The families of Samantha Miller and Mark Jenkins sat on opposite sides of the aisle, enduring the agonizing process of having their private lives and deepest pains exposed and analyzed in public. The future of Mark Jenkins rested in the hands of 12 individuals from Westmoreland County. In their closing argument, the prosecution reiterated the undeniable facts. Mark Jenkins armed himself, confronted Samantha Miller, and shot her multiple times, causing her death. They argued that while the motive was tragic, it did not excuse the act of murder. They contended that there was sufficient time between the alleged discovery and the shooting for Mark to form the intent to kill or inflict serious bodily harm. Supporting a charge of first or third-degree homicide, they emphasized the violence of the struggle and the number of shots fired as indicative of malice and intent. They asked the jury to hold Mark Jenkins accountable for his actions, regardless of the provocation he claimed. The defense delivered an impassioned closing argument, focusing entirely on the concept of sudden passion and the catastrophic emotional impact of the alleged discovery. They painted a picture of a man blindsided by the ultimate betrayal on the most significant day of his life. They argued that the circumstances fit the definition of voluntary manslaughter, a killing committed without malice but under the influence of sudden and intense passion resulting from serious provocation. They urged the jury to consider the human element, the shock, the confusion, and the profound emotional pain Mark must have been experiencing in those moments. They argued that this was a tragedy, not a calculated murder, and that the verdict should reflect that distinction. Following closing arguments, the judge provided the jury with instructions, outlining the relevant laws regarding homicide and voluntary manslaughter in Pennsylvania, explaining the elements of each charge they needed to consider based on the evidence presented. They were instructed on how to evaluate intent, malice, provocation, and the concept of sudden heat of passion. The 12 jurors retired to begin their deliberations. The waiting period was agonizing for everyone involved. The fate of Mark Jenkins, and the legal interpretation of the tragedy that occurred on June 14th, lay behind closed doors. Hours turned into a full day of deliberation. The jury requested to review certain pieces of evidence, including the text messages and portions of Robert Jenkins's testimony, indicating they were carefully weighing the evidence related to the alleged affair and its timing. The tension in the courthouse remained high. Families and legal teams waited, hoping for a resolution but bracing themselves for the outcome. The small town of North Huntingdon was holding its breath, waiting for the legal system to render its judgment on the dark events that had shattered its peace. Finally, after a day and a half of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They returned to the courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. Mark Jenkins stood stoically as the verdict was read. The jury found Mark Jenkins guilty of third-degree murder. This verdict indicated that the jury believed Mark Jenkins killed Samantha Miller with malice, but did not find sufficient evidence of premeditation, first degree, or that the killing occurred during the commission of another felony, second degree. It suggested the jury may have accepted the defense's argument about the emotional provocation to some extent, but not to the level required for voluntary manslaughter, which requires the absence of malice. The finding of malice, despite the provocation, was key to the third-degree verdict. The sentencing phase followed several weeks later. In Pennsylvania, third-degree murder carries a maximum sentence of 20 to 40 years in state prison. Victim impact statements were read, detailing the profound grief and loss experienced by Samantha Miller's family and friends. They spoke of her life, her potential, and the brutal way it was extinguished just hours before her wedding. Her parents described the irreplaceable void left in their lives, the constant pain of losing their daughter. They spoke about the devastation that had consumed their family and the community in North Huntingdon. The defense argued for leniency, reiterating the circumstances of the crime and Mark's state of mind at the time. They presented evidence of his lack of prior criminal history and his remorse. Mark Jenkins himself spoke briefly, expressing regret for his actions, though his words were filtered through the constraints of the legal process and his emotional state. His father, Robert Jenkins, also spoke, expressing deep sorrow for his role in the events and the destruction wrought upon both families. His voice was heavy with the weight of his own actions and their unimaginable consequences. The judge considered the evidence presented during the trial, the impact statements, and the arguments made during sentencing. The sentence handed down was 20 to 40 years in a state correctional institution. The judge acknowledged the tragic circumstances, but emphasized the gravity of taking a human life and the violence of the act. Mark Jenkins was immediately taken into custody to begin serving his sentence. The legal case was closed, but the human cost lingered far beyond the courtroom doors in North Huntingdon. The events of June 14th left an indelible scar on the community of North Huntingdon, Pennsylvania. A day intended for joy and the union of two families became a day of death and devastating betrayal. Samantha Miller was buried, her life cut short in her wedding dress, a symbol of a future tragically stolen. The wedding hall remained unused, the plans rendered meaningless by violence. The house on Oak Avenue became a grim landmark, a silent testament to the horror that occurred within its walls. The memory of the untouched wedding cake and the hanging dress served as haunting reminders of the normalcy that existed just hours before the world of two families was irrevocably shattered. The ripple effects extended far beyond the principal figures. Friends, neighbors, and members of the community grappled with the reality that such darkness could erupt in their quiet suburban town. The trust between individuals and families was shaken, the layers of secrets exposed, leaving a lingering sense of unease. Robert Jenkins faced the consequences of his actions not through criminal charges related to the homicide, but through the profound guilt and shame of his involvement, and the public knowledge of his betrayal, which had catastrophic repercussions for his son and the woman he had been involved with. He remained in North Huntingdon, his life permanently altered by the events he helped set in motion. For Samantha Miller's family, life was marked by an immeasurable absence. Holidays, birthdays, and everyday moments were now tinged with the profound grief of her loss. The legal outcome, while providing a measure of justice in the form of a conviction and sentence, could never restore what was taken. The court process had brought the painful details to light, forcing them to relive the worst day of their lives. But it could not fill the void left by their daughter. Her memory became a quiet ache, a constant reminder of the future she would never have. Mark Jenkins began serving his decades-long sentence. His life, too, was defined by the events of that single morning. The man who was to be a groom on June 14th became inmate number, serving time for taking the life of his bride. His family, fractured by the scandal and the crime, bore the burden of his actions and the role of his father's secret. The narrative of their family, once one of respectability in North Huntingdon, was forever rewritten by the events on Oak Avenue. The tragedy served as a stark, devastating illustration of how secrets, betrayal, and sudden rage can obliterate futures and leave only ruins behind, even in the most ordinary of places. The silence left in the wake of the gunshots was a silence filled with loss, shame, and the permanent echoes of a wedding day that turned fatal.